picture, and that's great because we're mostly passionate about some part of it and expert on some part of it, not necessarily the whole thing. So here you're going to get some ideas from a philosopher who cares about child maltreatment and who focuses on the worst cases for the most part, the most unfit parents or the most dangerous situations for children. All right, so what I'm going to do in 30 or 40 minutes of speaking before we have a conversation is first to talk about what I think is most damaging to children, then to suggest that the reforms that might be needed to avoid that damage might come from a source that you wouldn't expect politically. Third, I'm going to give you 10 fundamental truths that policymakers, social workers, and scholars need to adopt. So have your pens ready for that one. And then because this is a journalism-focused class, I'm going to throw out 10 questions that journalists might want to ask particular players in the child welfare system. All right, so to begin with, in a general way, the two things that are most damaging to children today, I think, are very bad parents and very bad neighborhoods. And both tend to be self-recreating in the sense that very bad parents damage children who then themselves become very bad parents. Very bad neighborhoods tend to damage the residents in a way they grow up and become contributors to the problems. Significantly, the United States legal system has already made the policy judgment that some people should be denied the opportunity to become parents. This is reflected in adoption laws, right? So we have fairly rigorous screening of applicants for adoption, and some people we tell, you may not become a parent. It's also reflected in a very modest way in the law relating to biological parents. The Adoption Safe Families Act of '96 required states to authorize termination of parental rights, in some cases even when a child has not yet been abused, so in theory it could be done at birth, if the parent has done very bad things to other children. So based on history with other children, we will say as to a newborn child, to biological parents, you may not become, the parents may not be able to raise this child because we can terminate your rights immediately. So there is some recognition of this idea that some people should never become parents, at least as to particular children. But there are several reasons why that idea is not much realized in practice, in particular with respect to biological parents. First, the category of parents that ASFA, the Adoption Safe Families Act, required us to identify as people who might be denied parenthood in the first instance is too narrow. Right? So it requires horrible behavior as to another child, but doesn't capture people who simply have serious drug problems now, serious mental illnesses, parents who are incarcerated. In addition, detection of severely unfit parents is now limited in a formal way to drug addicts. So we require reporting to Child Protection Services of newborns who are drug exposed at birth, but there is no other category, there is no other basis for notifying Child Protection Services at the birth of a child that parents are problematic. You don't have to find out a parent's history and let Child Protection Services know if there was prior child abuse. In addition, social workers, I think, generally disagree with this idea that some parents should be simply refused the opportunity to parent a child that they just gave birth to. I think judges are also resistant to ordering terminations when there hasn't been extensive rehabilitation efforts. The laws don't require CPS in general to do anything adverse to parents, but for the most part just allow them to. So most child protection directions to CPS are permissive rather than mandatory. In addition, even if social workers are on board and want to act aggressively, there are gaps in the law that mean they don't have the authority necessarily to take a problem case through all the steps that lead up to termination of parental rights. So the ASFA goal, ASFA did result in states amending their termination rules, but not the rules for reporting, for removal, for protective orders, and so forth. And in addition, and this is something that those of you in the School of Social Work can speak to, it seems that in general, no one is trained to do what I call triage. To figure out who are the parents who are such low probability prospects for rehabilitation that we should terminate them immediately. And who, on the other hand, is a good prospect for rehabilitation, a good risk, that we should devote resources to. I've never heard, it may exist, but my understanding is that social workers are generally trained to help people, to assist them, and they don't learn when do you cut someone off, right? They're not trained, they're not given protocols. How do you decide when someone's a lost cause? So that's part of the explanation why in most jurisdictions that I'm familiar with, they are resistant to doing so. Shifting to the zoning article that apparently you were forced to read, the U.S. legal system has also recognized that there are some places where children should not live. Right, so we've already gotten past that hurdle of accepting this idea that there are just some environments where it's wrong for kids to be, and the state will order people not to have their children living there. So we've done this with respect to physical toxicity in fairly large geographical areas, right? So you can't live next to a factory that's spewing pollution, and some other places where there are physical toxins. We've also recognized that socially toxic places are ones where children should not live if they are within a particular home. So we will identify some homes as socially toxic because of the people who live in them, and say the child may not live there. So if mom is living in a home with sex offender, meth lab, drug dealer, violent person, abuser, the law already authorizes removal of a child on that basis. Right, but what we haven't done is to sort of combine these two concepts and recognize that there can be socially toxic space outside of homes where children also should not live and where homes should not be located. We haven't made that step, even though we know quite well that children don't spend all their time at home, although some parents in the worst neighborhoods put their kids into lockdown when they come home from school because they know the neighborhood is too dangerous. And we do this even though we know about neighborhood effect, even though this is well documented that neighborhoods present direct dangers to children and indirectly harm children by stressing their parents and undermining their parenting ability. All right, so that's a piece of current reality in child protection law and in zoning law, you might call it, or just control of space where children live, that I think contributes substantially to harms that children incur. So naturally, changing to protect children follows terminating more often and more quickly, identifying earlier in a child's life parents who are incapable of providing adequate care. And I suggest not allowing children to live in certain places, knowing that there is not the political will to actually change those places in a permanent way while the children remain. And the problem is, politically, in my view, that the constituency you might expect to get behind child welfare measures in general, and I'm going to do some generalizing and stereotyping, won't expect liberals to be at the forefront of acting to protect children in poor communities. My perception, my observation is that they are actually most likely to oppose any measures that entail aggressive action against parents. As a general matter, liberals are happy to support programs of spending on new programs to try to help children and poor families collectively, but they are unwilling both to recognize a conflict of interests between adults and children in poor communities and to take aggressive measures to protect children, even if it might result in some further suffering or loss of liberty for adults. And I see this in part with child protection laws. I have proposed legislation in Virginia to try to identify unfit birth parents at birth. I proposed a cross-check system under which information given to the Vital Records Department would be put in a database with child maltreatment histories and criminal histories, and red flags would be raised for CPS when there was a match, and an assessment would be done. And it was opposed principally by liberals who had concerns about privacy of parents, even though this is information that's already in the state's hands. I advocated also broadening the categories of termination of parental rights, of making CPS movements toward termination mandatory rather than permissive. And bear in mind always that termination rules require that termination be in a child's best interests, no matter what, right? So every basis for terminating says you must find X plus best interests. So it's never the case that you just unthinkingly terminate based on incarceration or drug abuse or something else. There has to be an evidence-based conclusion, clear and convincing evidence, in fact, that it's in the child's best interests. So there is the child protection context, but there are others as well. I'm writing now about domestic violence and children's exposure to it. Research demonstrates the psychological trauma that children experience, the dangers that they are, the risk that they are at for spillover violence. So there are certainly situations where battering of a custodial mother is repeated, and the children really need to get out of that situation. There are certainly some situations in which removal is appropriate from maternal custody. But the legal scholarship on domestic violence pretty uniformly is opposed to removal in any cases. Right? This is liberal family law scholars, criminal law scholars saying never separate a child from the mother, and there will always be a rationalization after the fact as to why that's also best for the children. Right? The harm isn't so great. Kids really need to be with the mother. You just traumatize the children further. No consideration of whether there's another parent who might be available, other family members who could take custody. It's just no removal. That's punishing the victim. Daniel mentioned the race to proportionality conference that we attended. This pattern, the demographics of foster care, well known. Children of minority race are disproportionately in foster care. The predominant reaction among liberals has been, well, we must be overreacting in the case of minority race families, let's do that less. Without any evidence that any of the interventions were inappropriate, any of the removals were inappropriate. From an adult-centered perspective, you see harm to the black adults and to a community. But from a child-centered perspective, if there is disproportionate removal based on race, the harm might very well be to white children who aren't removed often enough. A couple of other examples. When private or public organizations have attempted to induce drug abusers, female drug abusers, to take Norplant or some other long-term contraceptive, giving them money or needles or whatever, liberal organizations generally come out adamantly opposed to this, right? You're coercing people in use of their reproductive capacity, very bad thing. From a child-centered perspective, sounds like it could be good, right? You prevent more children from being born into horrible circumstances, and maybe you help the children that already exist, whose parents would just be further stressed by having another pregnancy. The last example, to me, epitomizes this broader phenomenon of liberals consistently siding with adults in situations where there's a conflict of interest with children, and when you're talking about poor minority race communities. And that's prison nurseries. Right, so this is a growing phenomenon in the US. 20 years ago, there was one state that had prison nurseries, New York. If you go back further, there were many more, but most of them closed down because they decided this was not good for the children. So 20 years ago, it was just New York. Now we have almost 10 states, it's 8 or 9 now, that have created prison nursery programs. So when a woman enters prison pregnant and gives birth, she's entitled to keep the child with her, and she and the baby will live in a prison. Some have special units, some don't. Will live in the prisons for as many as 3 years in Washington State. These programs are pushed by advocates for women prisoners, not by child advocates. They're paid for by conservatives who are convinced, who become convinced that this will reduce recidivism. Even though there are no studies showing that it does in fact reduce recidivism, even though there is no empirical support for the supposition that this is good for the children, these programs are passing almost unanimously in state legislatures. Connecticut will probably be next. Right, and so children are starting their lives in prison, coming to identify prisons as their home, and having their fates tied to women whose chances for success after leaving prison is very poor. The only study that's actually been done of outcomes for these children, the success rate, if you define that as secure attachment and stay with mom for, say, 5 years, is less than 20%. Right, so the vast majority of these children are not having a secure attachment and or separating from mother while mom remains in prison or after release. If she returns to drugs, returns to prison, and so forth. So that to me epitomizes this broader phenomenon of liberals whose sympathy is with poor people in general, but primarily identifying with the adults, adopting positions that first and foremost mitigate the suffering of these people who've had very disadvantaged lives. Perfectly understandable. But overlooking the fact that in the process they might be harming children. Mind you, they are. And either not considering the effect on children or making unrealistic speculation about positive outcomes for children. So the thesis of a book that I'm working on now is that liberals, and I'm a Texan-spent liberal, I should confess, that liberals bear a large share of the responsibility for this intergenerational cycle that we see in poor communities. And one might say because that population in inner cities is predominantly of minority race, perpetuating the subordination of African Americans. It's a little bit controversial, but I thought I'd throw that idea out there as well. So, if I no longer see liberals in legislatures as likely sources of support for the kinds of reforms that I need, what about conservatives? Well, there's reason for thinking they might actually be supportive. Right? Stereotyping again, generalizations. But if you want legislators who are kind of hard-nosed moralists, I don't pass judgment on these people. I'm not all about blame or judgment. It's just about can someone care for a child? And if not, what does the child need? But if conservatives are hard-nosed moralists, willing to pass judgment on people who they think make bad choices or can't get their own lives under control, there they are. Conservatives against paying for social services. Right now, the most unfit parents absorb a disproportionate amount of child protection services resources. stands to reason. We're not going to terminate them, we're going to try to rehabilitate, and we're going to pour a lot more services into their cases, and the marginal, more hopeful cases suffer. Right? Conservatives might like the idea of triage. Let's shift resources away from the worst, most hopeless cases, and concentrate them on those who are a good bet. In addition, they want to privatize dependency. They're generally pro-adoption. They have a wealthy constituency that's pro-adoption, right? And one outcome, one implication of earlier terminations is more adoptions. The problem with conservatives, one might think, is that the plight of poor children in blighted neighborhoods is not at the top of their radar. But there are exceptions. For example, we've seen prosecutors going after pregnant drug abusers, charging them with child abuse, trying to stretch the laws of child maltreatment, judges ordering people not to procreate, right? Being so fed up with seeing parents who multiple children in the foster care system keep giving birth. And as I said, they're pro-adoption as well. So it might be that conservatives are the best bet for getting support for some of these reforms. And I would just keep pushing the idea of triage with then let's use resources more efficiently on the hopeful cases and be willing to take hard measures against the unhopeful cases. Are you ready for 10 fundamental truths? I was raised Catholic. I have to have a list of fundamental truths. The first is that the state is responsible for the plight of maltreated children, children living in poverty, much more responsible than we recognize. Because the state creates parent-child relationships. It's obvious in the case of adoption, but with biological parents, it's evident in state statutes, right? There are parentage laws that decide the biological parent is going to raise a child. It could be otherwise, right? There could be exceptions, exclusions, it could just be a presumption that can be overcome. But in any case, it has to be a law that anyone has, to wave in their hand if they want to have custody of a child against someone else who might want to take that child away. It's the state that gives them that power. And in addition, the state empowers parents to control children's lives. It decides the extent of parental power. It could confer much more limited power on parents. For example, in the case of residential choice, saying you can live in a lot of places, you have a lot of choices, but Camden is not one of them, or some other place that you might think children should not live. Second fundamental truth, children's rights in relation to formation and dissolution of family legal relationships should be at least as strong as those of adults. Right, so think about the rights that you have in getting married, getting divorced. This is analogous right to becoming part of a parent-child relationship or having such a relationship dissolved. Right, so what are your rights if you start dating someone, they really like you, would suffer horribly if you declined their proposal of marriage. Turns out they have drug addiction, and you say, I'm walking. Right, you have an absolute right to do that based on nothing other than you decide it's in your best interest. Right, so from the perspective of moral theory, theory of rights, children ought to have something analogous, right? They ought to have a right at least as strong to someone acting as an agent for them, refusing relationships that are not in their best interests. So that's all that ought to be required to say that a parent-child relationship should not come into existence or should end, that it's in the child's best interests. Right? Then you give the child just exactly the same right you yourself have to refuse to get in or to choose to get out of a relationship. And in addition, it's also a feature of our relationship rights that we can impose conditions on other people. Right? So someone proposes marriage to you, and they say, but, you know, I'm going to live in East St. Louis. And you say, not me, no way, right? So if you want a relationship with me, you have to leave that place or not enter there in the first place. Children ought to have exactly the same right or an analogous right to have that condition imposed on the relationship for adults who want to be their parents. Third fundamental truth. CPS is not good at fixing deeply dysfunctional people. And we should not expect them to be. Number 4, newborns are different. One pervasive problem with child protection law, and to a large extent practice, is that we don't differentiate between a child who has no relationship with a parent yet and an older child who has a well-established relationship, even if it's not an especially good relationship. Right? So a 10-year-old who has grown up with parents, however bad they are, likely still identifies them as parents and feels some emotional connection to them, some emotional tie, and will suffer if you sever that connection. As a general matter, that seems true. But not so with a newborn child, right? Very different situation. Newborns are also different because they're adopted. Right? Try to get a 10-year-old who's been maltreated, adopted, very difficult. Demand for newborns among adoption applicants, very high. It's hard to get figures, but I think this is true even with respect to special needs newborns. And in addition, newborns, even if they are damaged, say by drug exposure, have a much better chance of recovery, of overcoming that damage, than is an older child who has suffered years of maltreatment. All of these special features of newborns, I think, counsels in favor very strongly of getting it right very early and then devoting your child's welfare and parent rehabilitation services to those parents that you do give legal parent status to. Right? So exclude the least promising parents right at birth, if you can, and then concentrate your resources, invest in those that you do give parent status to. Number 5, damaged children need super parents, not ordinary parents. So when you think about reunification with children who've been removed, who've been damaged by maltreatment or drug exposure or something else, to think not just in terms of have parents risen to a level of barely getting along, but can this parent deal with a child who now has special needs? Number 6, even with older children, we have to ask about attachment. And again, I could be wrong. I've never been a caseworker. I've spoken a lot with child protection workers in Virginia mostly, some in New York. But my sense is that there's not routinely an assessment of attachment relationships with child protection interventions. Maybe it's different in California. But it's got to be important to the best interest calculus. It's got to be important to knowing whether you try to reunify, what the nature of that relationship is. And attachment is a big piece of that as well. We know that the rate of secure attachment with dysfunctional parents is poor. 7, neighborhood matters hugely in the ways that I've described. Number 8, blameworthiness should be irrelevant. And one of the problems, I mentioned this one because one of the problems that I perceive with CPS caseworkers not acting aggressively enough, in particular being opposed to reunification bypass, familiar with that concept where you can move to termination without seeking to reunify, is that they tend to identify with parents, they view parents as their clients, and they find it extraordinarily difficult to pull the termination plug unless they can blame the parents somehow, unless they can say, well, you deserve this. Right? Absent that, it's got to be extraordinarily difficult to tell a parent that they're done. Right? But blame shouldn't have anything to do with it. It should just be about the child's needs and the parent's ability. And with respect to mental illness, that's a good illustration. People aren't responsible for being mentally ill, but sometimes it's severe enough that they just can't parent. Lastly, a couple of fundamental truths about the law that, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about parents' rights and about constitutional law, especially among people who aren't lawyers or law professors. And one is that the Supreme Court has never held that parents have a constitutional right to something that's bad for their children. Right? So sometimes you'll hear CPS directors talk about particular cases, and they'll say that it seems best for the child that you act very quickly and do this, and they'll say, you know, but parents have rights. If they mean to be saying something about constitutional law, they're mistaken. And secondly, the Supreme Court has never held that unfit parents have a constitutional right to anything. Period. Right? So if you hear CPS directors talking about constitutional rights after parents, after they've been adjudicated as unfit, they don't know what they're talking about. And the last chapter is 10 questions that you might pose to actors in the child welfare world. And the first half dozen are for CPS directors. And much of this just follows from what I've said before. Essentially doing this journalism thing and writing stories. Maybe you'll go out and ask people questions. I'll get some pointed ones, I hope, that might help you do that. So I've always wanted, after there's a case in the news of some horrible maltreatment, tragic, to try to find out what the family's history is with CPS, whether the agency could have known. Because CPS has this large database and has access to more databases that it's just not using, to try to identify in advance parents who are very likely to maltreat their children. Second question I would have for CPS directors is, how many parents are repeat players? And I guess that most of them would tell you that they don't know. And so you should ask them why they don't know. I would ask CPS directors what kind of formalized monitoring of parents they do after a termination of parental rights, i.e. to see if they are having more children, or after a criminal conviction of felony child abuse. Fourth, I'd like to know what kind of follow-up they do on positive toxicology cases. So these have to be reported if a hospital detects positive toxicology. Typically there's just an assessment, offering of services. But I wonder what the data is on what kind of interventions they do and what kind of outcomes. Is this actually helping? This requirement that there be a reporting to CPS, is it actually accomplishing anything? I don't know the answer to that. I would ask them whether they assess attachments when they respond to maltreatment reports, when they're deciding whether there needs to be removal or not, whether they should reunify. And I would ask them how often they do reunification bypasses, and if they say never, then ask why. Question for Dean of Social Work School. Do you teach any kind of triage decision-making? In any context, do you teach people how to make a call when further services are not going to be helpful? Do you ever apply this to child's maltreatment cases? Are social workers receiving any training of that kind? There might be some schools, but I'm just not aware. The last few are for legislators. I would ask them, why is it that CPS is merely permitted to do what's in children's best interests and not required when it's action against the parents? In addition, why don't you direct CPS to implement an early detection system, including monitoring of convicted or terminated child abusers? Why don't you direct CPS to introduce a triage protocol? And then the last question for legislatures would be, are there any places in your jurisdiction where you would not take your children or grandchildren for a walk? And if so, should any child have to live there? Thank you for your attention. If no one is too aghast or horrified, I will welcome your questions and deflect everything to experts in the room.
Thank you. Before we kick it out to the room, I just had one question because I've heard this twice now. And you talked about calculus in terms of making a determination or creating a system where you could tell who would be the parents that you would want to terminate parenthood or terminate the child's their rights over the child at birth. So you mentioned the attachment, so that would go against them. What other diagnostic tools do you see, and how close are we to having them? I know that Emily Hutton-Hornstein, who's here and at USC, has looked at birth records in California and can say that if you've got 3 at-birth risk factors, that's going to be about 25% of the kids, and they will represent 50% of the kids that enter into the child welfare system. So it seems like you've got some pretty good indicators, but what would you include in that calculation?
I would leave it to Emily and Jill and other people with that kind of expertise to create a protocol, a checklist for CPS to do if they were to do an assessment at birth. And it's not my expertise to create those kinds of things, but obviously we're talking about substance abuse and mental illness, history with other children, support factors. Do you have supportive family and community? What's the nature of your neighborhood? Things like that. The percentages that you threw out there
may be wrong. Can somebody correct me? I think it was either 15 to 50 or 25 to 50. You guys remember that from class? Wow. It's pretty stark. Let's say that.
Right, so they represent 50% of the CPS caseload.
Yeah, all the kids were going to enter into the system, so you can see that.
But that doesn't mean that 50% of them are going to have the CPS, right?
Right.
Right. And I mean, these are neighborhood factors. These are not.
Well, no, the at-birth risk factors include, low birth rate, which is not neighborhood specific. and these other things. They're not completely neighborhood specific, but if we're looking at how do you determine who is going to abuse their child, these are things, you know, in Jim's world that we would include into this calculus.
But what you want to know is, what are the odds for this particular parent and child? How likely is it that this child would suffer certain experiences or problems in life? And it raises an interesting theoretical question of what the percentage should have to be. You know, so what percent of chance, suppose you're going to be born again, and we said, with your biological parents, 25% chance that you're going to suffer severe physical abuse. Is that enough for you to say, I want different parents? I think nobody really thinks about this question of what is the percent, what is the tipping point? You know, what are the odds that we want to have? We do it kind of in inchoate way in dating relationships, right? So what are the odds this person is going to have successful rehab? Should I keep dating or not? I think that with adult relationship, we apply a pretty low percentage, right? We don't give people so much of a chance. But with parents, as a general matter, my perception is if there's 0.5% chance that they will not be abusive, then we keep going.
Any questions? Jane?
A lot of your argument hinges on essentially predictive tools.
On what, Jim? On predictive.
Predictive tools. I think your argument is that we could, if we worked hard enough, generate relatively precise predictive tools that would be sufficiently compelling that we would then have a good reason to say this child is at risk in this setting and we ought to terminate rights. I think that's your argument, am I right? More or less?
Right, I wouldn't claim as an empirical matter that that's true. It's my hope.
Aha,
And
okay,
I
well
still
that's
see
what
yes as using something now to make reunification decisions versus termination. They just wait a couple of years, you know, they react for a couple of years, and then they say, well, now let's assess what the odds are. But sorry.
Well, but exactly that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I think that's at the crux of your argument. And it's sort of like the economist's argument, and you're on the desert island and you have a can, and then you say, well, okay, well, let's assume you have a can opener, and then you're fine, right? I don't know if I'm right, but I'm asking.
You're absolutely right, yeah.
I mean, back to Emily's, I think you're right. She had a tool, her work found that you could predict a group that had double the odds of child maltreatment in the next, I think we were just saying 5 years. It was 5 years. But the overall risk of child maltreatment in the next 5 years in the population is very low. So doubling that risk leaves you with a rate that's very low, which leaves you with the very, very large majority of people in that identified category not having child maltreatment. So you've got a slightly more precise but wildly imprecise tool, right? I think. So I guess I'm really interested in the logic of your argument, and I'd love to move a little further into seeing how to make it more usable.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's important to note that the decision has to be made sometime when children do enter the system, right? You face exactly the same question. What assessment tool do you have at the 15 out of 22 month mark to say, you know, now is the right time to terminate because the odds are no good? I mean, we're making this decision to terminate at some point with a very large number of children, and if we have no good basis for making any predictions about these people, right? They could always turn around the next day, then we never know what we're doing, right? And that might be the case. But the rest of my argument is, if we can do it with any rationality at the 2-year mark or the 3-year mark, then we can do it at birth, right? And if you want to see, well, the parent does actually have demonstrated proclivity to abuse, well, then look at prior terminations where there's been abuse to some other child. Maybe this child's different, maybe it's not. But, it seems like a fairly reliable prediction.
Jill?
The only thing I wanted to add is the place where I'm asking triage coming to child welfare is around what child welfare workers routinely call legal risk. And so legal risk is generally this notion that a child is coming into foster care and there is a legal mandate to try to reunify some point along the line, and that's an interesting question, where that happened, social workers determined that there is a legal risk associated with the potential for reunification or not reunification. And the kids who are at low legal risk then get moved into concurrent planning, meaning they're not at risk of reunification. And so it's interesting that reunification is called a legal risk. If they're not at risk of reunification, they're more likely to move into adoption. So they put them in concurrent planning home, which then moves them towards adoption. If they're at high legal risk, then they might decide to keep them in foster care, not in a concurrent home, and then let time sort of work things out. Is that Erica? Erica's done work on this as well. Yeah, that's good experience.
It's interesting because this concept of risk just, evokes notions of percentages, right?
Yeah.
Is there any, what tool do they use to?
Well, that's just, they don't typically use a tool. So when you go out and you say, well, how do you decide who's at legal risk? There's practice wisdom. So no, there's not a lot of precision in that. Yeah.
Would you argue that we're in a place to get more precision, like today, as opposed to in the past?
Sure. Yeah, sure. We're moving that direction.
Michael and Joan.
So, Jim, to continue the discussion we've had, various ways. So I take of your 10 truths, I think that at least 7.5 of them are true. Okay, that they are right and true. It is also the case that that those 7.5 truths are all in California law now. Okay, and they've been in California law since 1982 in a statute that covered all this. So that under California law since 1982, there were a category of cases, almost all focused on newborns, because we do divide various rules by age of the child in California, that are a category of cases in which there should not be reunification. Included among them are having killed a previous child, having been found, brought into the child welfare system for anything, and having received services and had another child have to be removed after receiving services. There are actually 5 different factors that are in that. There is fairly rigid timetables for termination of parental rights, and in fact, in it, there is a statute that the statute says that unless you find that there is a strong attachment, you shall terminate it. So it brings attachment into it as a category that the department has to evaluate, and puts the presumption saying terminate absent finding that attachment would make it not be the case. There are a whole bunch of these things. I could go through all of them that have been in it for a long period of time. They don't get implemented in a significant way, although in the last 7 to 10 years, there's been much more termination of parental rights, both initially, but particularly after a relatively short period of time, of 0 to 2-year-olds. About half the kids that come in and are removed in the child welfare system now are being terminated. 0 to 2-year-olds are not being reunified, but are being terminated. So there's a lot of movement. But what I raised for discussion of both the policy people and all the people active in various ways is the people in the system bring in sets of views about how they want to act in a variety of ways. And if you build something that is totally contrary to the way that they that the actors in it want to act, you actually get perverse outcomes. So one of the difficulties is that if you don't try reunification services in most situations, even though they're not very high probability reunifications, the judges and social workers are reluctant to remove in the first place because they see it as a death sentence. So, but if you create a shortened time period and reasonable termination standards, you can actually get to it at a later point much more efficiently than if you do it all the way up front because of behavior. It seems to me in everything, and we talked a little bit about this on the neighborhood effects. It's very hard to define neighborhoods. Neighborhoods end on one block and the next block. We found that, is that an okay neighborhood? And how you implement all of these kinds of truths that are in there seem to me the critical thing in a policy-making perspective, and also in an operational perspective for social workers, and in a questioning mode for journalists of saying, look at the, I think we have lots of rules on the book that reflect a lot of these premises, and the breakdowns are in implementation, and understanding that is really a critical aspect of all of this.
Well, another fundamental truth is California is better at everything.
No, there are actually, many other states have pretty much the same statutory.
There are 3 states that have incarceration as a basis for termination. There might be one other that has substance abuse as a reunification bypass.
California doesn't, but most states have some grounds for non-reunification.
Oh, of course, they have
begin
to.
with. It's only a question of whether they've added all of the grounds that you want, but most states have moved in this direction.
Well, ASPA required all the states to have certain bases for termination without reunification efforts, but they were prior termination, felony convictions for assault on a child, killing the other parent, aggravated circumstances, which states get to define however they want, right? And there have only been a couple of states that have gone beyond that. Virginia hasn't even put every one of them into place. So the prevailing rule is just what ASPA required and nothing more. And ASPA does not say anything about incarceration. ASPA does not say anything about substance abuse. It doesn't say anything about mental illness. Right, so some of the indicators that one might rely on are not present, are not a basis for reunification bypass. Boundaries of the zones don't worry me too much. You identify census tracts where you have the deepest dysfunctions, the most dangerous to children, ideally we would give full financial support to people to help them move, but relocation is not the end of the world. If it has to be a couple of census tracts away, it's not quite the same as terminating parental rights or getting hit by a bullet.
Joan, you were.
Well, just to pick up a little bit on your ASPA point, you imply somehow that there's a federal responsibility for determining parentage or screening individuals and setting standards, hopefully more and more precise, that could weed out the bad actors or the dangerous prospective parents. And you don't bother to consider, at least in your remarks here, the extraordinary danger of empowering the federal government for making determinations about fitness.
I didn't say anything about the federal government.
Well, you want an expanded list of aggravated circumstances that would justify judicial termination of parental rights either at birth or as close to birth as possible in your schema. I think it's risky enough to have the license given at the state level to develop their own list of so-called aggravated circumstances. quite telling that since '97, when ASCA was enacted, as you say, most states haven't rushed in there to attempt to spell out those circumstances. We in California actually expanded this list. Michael said something like 4 or 5 different factors, and indeed there are pages now of the Welfare and Institutions Code that permit bypass without services. But I don't think you should yourself bypass the significance of Michael's point that there are so many ways in which actors in the system, whether they be the caseworker or the judge or the lawyer representing the parent or the lawyer representing the child or the lawyer representing the state and external social service providers are collectively loath to call it quits. You offer blameworthiness. I mean, don't blame, just designate the fit and the unfit, as if that were potentially a realistic possibility. Collectively, you have a system that pulls back from the prospect of judging their fellow citizens in advance of evidence, judging them on the basis of a tool yet to be invented that could pinpoint who is going to be the dangerous parent and who is not going to be the dangerous parent. I think a lot of us regard this reluctance as very valuable because we don't have confidence in the possibility of being able to develop with such a degree of precision a way of targeting some of our fellow citizens as not fit to parent. That doesn't mean we lack concern even about early intervention. A lot of concern about early intervention and diversionary or triage programs. But you might think that a number of your observations about the dangers that children do face and the harms that are inflicted over time and in the short run on children, hampering their prospects for the future, would generate something less than the nuclear option that you offer. And that maybe it isn't time yet to give up on more community-based and neighborhood-based support programs and outreach services. I know there's a lot of concern about the limitations, for example, of the home visiting, the nurse visiting programs, and the old model, and the like. And yet, the home visiting approach, the non-punitive service outreach for all, particularly in a high-risk neighborhood, along with a little bit of this dose and a little bit of preschool dose and better child care dose. I mean, that is the harvesting of the resources we don't have to deal with communal and neighborhood and family interventions that don't harvest our resources in order to trigger the bad actor. And that's aside from my very great skepticism about our capacity to ever develop a more precise tool. The adoption screening tools you mentioned are hopelessly inadequate and untested. We have never had any kind of systematic research on whether the evaluations in a classic adoption situation actually keep out the bad actors rather than discourage people of good faith from pursuing a desire to be parents. There's no research. So I'm not impressed by your comment that we already say to some people, you can't parent. In addition to which, the screening devices that are used hardly food and wine. So, I mean, there's sort of that. In any case, I find your insistence that you're not blaming, you're not targeting, you're thinking of the child, to be ultimately very naive.
Thank you. If I sounded optimistic, I misrepresented myself. I see the resistance from caseworkers, judges, and what I see is identification with the parents. Drug courts are a perfect example. I've seen judges in Richmond, Virginia, who deal with parents for years, trying to get them to pull around so that they can take care of their children, and they weep with these parents, and they go down and hug them, and there's much of the explanation for why it is so difficult to take hard measures against bad parents. There is research on outcomes for adopted children versus regular children. I guess we should talk about what you think
Well,
is missing.
there are outcomes on adopted children, that's quite different. I was talking about outcomes or evaluations of the evaluations.
Now, it might be that we don't know
We
what
have
we're doing
no
in any
idea.
context.
We have no idea.
Right, so we should stop screening for adoption. If someone applies for adoption and they say, yes, I was terminated, had my parental rights terminated as to another child, I would say, no biggie, right? We're not about blaming here. Here's a child for you. We've got a backlog in foster care. But for some reason, we feel confident in saying that person applying for adoption should be excluded. Right, just get out of jail for sex offenses against a child. We're going to exclude you. But maybe we don't know what we're doing. Maybe that's a mistake, and we're leaving kids in foster care unparented because we are irrationally assuming that we know something about the dangers to a child of being in the custody of people with these histories. I don't know, where's the presumption lie? These policy questions often come down to it. Where does you presume in favor of anyone who wants to be a parent, or you presume against? Presume only in favor of biological parents? Why? Or everyone?
Joe,
I think if we had good name, we might be surprised at the degree to which many of your recommendations are in fact what is actually happening. We know, for example, in California, that newborns who enter care, they're most likely outcome is adoption. The successful ramification is rare. We know that a lot of those kids have already had siblings in care. So apparently having a sibling in care really facilitates your entry into care as a newborn. So we don't have good data on all this stuff, but to the degree we do, I think we're surprised at what's happening. And there are evidence-based evaluation tools being developed for use in adoption. So it's becoming less of a crapshoot than it's been.
So it's encouraging. It sounds like California's doing a fair amount of foster adopt, if not concurrent planning.
Yeah.
Again, California does tend to be better at a lot of things, and it's just true. I don't know what the figures are for other states, but there's also the problem, or the question, which children are being removed at birth? Is it just the positive tox kids? Or are we catching others who might be in grave danger?
Could you speak really quickly on the plan that you proposed in terms of the zoning in the neighborhoods? Is that big enough that you caught what I was saying? I could be mixing it.
You just want me to talk more about the zoning idea?
If you could just break it down, for those who aren't part of it, I just want to hear you.
Okay, so the idea was several areas of law to take better account of neighborhood effect, which is the adverse consequences of being in a deeply dysfunctional neighborhood with violence, drugs, high unemployment, people who prey on children, and concentrated poverty. We can do this in domestic relations law by favoring parents for custody if they don't live in such a place. We can do it in child protection law by taking into account neighborhood when deciding whether to remove and whether to return. And I suggest, as a kind of thought experiment, really, what if we just said, given that we know, we're just not going to suddenly devote a lot more resources to eliminating all the horrible places in our country. What if we just said there are some places children may not live? And anyone who's there now with children needs to move out, just as we would say to someone who's living in a home, where the very same things are going on. You may not live there anymore if you want to retain custody of your child. Just broadening this concept of an unfit place from a home, which is well accepted, to a neighborhood. Right, and ideally, again, taxes have been liberal. I'll throw, throwing money into housing subsidies that, don't now exist, into relocation subsidies. So ideally, you would assist people in moving, and only those who, despite the assistance, refuse to move will lose custody of their children. That's the idea.
I was just curious what your background experience is with working with unfit neighborhoods and whether you've been able to have direct contact with families that you would deem unfit, therefore your theory is less theoretical but more practical.
Not sure what you mean by experience, observation, interacting with people who are involved, social workers, prosecutors.
No, I mean like the parents, like how often have you come in interaction with parents so that your theory is grounded in actual real life experience and
Well, that would probably be mostly limited to observing court proceedings, a lot of court proceedings involving
so you've
parents.
never actually talked to unfit parents?
Well, I represented children for a period of time, and in that context, yes, but they weren't from these kinds of neighborhoods. But again, my work is theoretical. If it doesn't play out in practice because of practicalities, so be it. But it's worth thinking about things in a different way.
Well, it's just it's just a little scary that your decision-making process is actually influencing legislation. Because a lot
I
of
can't imagine that ever happening.
well, at least with passing a bill in Virginia, as you mentioned.
Oh, that was not neighborhood zoning. That was just cross-checking birth records, broader termination, stuff that Michael has made happen in California.
Well, we got lots. So you were raising hand earlier, so I kept it in my mind. I'm going to keep it in my mind.
I wonder if you're including developmental scientists in your discussion. We know that development is very plastic. We also know that poor parenting has the power to turn on or off genes, affects the development of neuroarchitecture. Child maltreatment or domestic violence is associated with all kinds of future health problems. So frankly, I tend to agree that that sentencing a child to continuing that kind of relationship and have a very predictable outcome is as much a nuclear option as removing children from their families.
That's an excellent point. We tend to only see state action when you separate a child from a parent, but there's also state action in forcing a child to continue living with a parent, and that can be a nuclear option, as you point out. If you have known dangers, that child could very well have been permanently and severely damaged or dead. Right, and the answer to your initial question was, I do try to read as much of the developmental literature as I can, and I say a lot in some other articles about the impact of child maltreatment, the impact of growing up in a prison, the impact of growing up in certain neighborhoods. And then also, sometimes you find gaps, and you say, I wish social scientists would look at this, but if they've never heard these questions, like should we evacuate certain neighborhoods of children, or should we terminate often at birth, then they don't know to research the empirical sub-questions, the underlying questions.
I mean, in the middle, between these nuclear options is also this notion that neighborhood maybe could be accounted for when you're making determinations on removal or not, and that's something that seems to be pretty devoid of our current legal framework. So somewhere in the middle of this all is all.
There's something.
There's something. There's a lot of people. Again, you want to go?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just go there to your big
question level and not worried about all the red flags of going up to social work. But so the two questions I have in my mind. One, have you thought about how you might imagine what a newborn would want? How we might try to answer that question. And then a totally separate thought experiment type question. Why do you think of this in terms of like a set of things that you might have done that would predict that you would have this bad outcome, as opposed to like how we issue driver's licenses, like have it be proactive rather than reactive? Like you have to be 16 and you have to pass a certain set of tests that show that you know how to drive before you get a driver's license, as opposed to have it be like, okay, you guys do, I'm not going to take it away.
Yeah, two great questions. So the second one, I try not to appear to be an extremist, believe it or not. So that's why I would suggest people have to pass a test for parenting, but there have been people who've done that. Hugh Lafayette, Jack Westmore, so the more well-known people who proposed licensing for parents, and I try never to use that word in my writing because it just immediately tags you as an extremist. But there's, of course, something to be said for it. And about what a newborn would want, yeah, I think it's a great experiment to imagine ourselves, as I suggested earlier, what if you were going to be born again tomorrow? Right, try to imagine that. And then try to imagine biological parents who have certain characteristics, history, circumstances, knowing that there are adoption applicants who would love to have you. Beautiful baby. What would it take for you to say, well, the biology is not that important, that it overrides all of this other stuff? I think that's a very useful way to think about it.
Not remain ghost towns. I think you all know what squats are. People will go into those neighborhoods and they'll recreate this problem that you want to move. And then what happens then? You just keep kicking these families out and these children out. Does that neighborhood ever see any help, any progress? So I do think where it goes will grow, more may grow. But if we just rip them all out and throw them into some neighborhood a family probably can't afford, I don't really know if you're actually fixing the problem.
By squats, you mean people with children?
I mean the idea of like if you were to take these families and these children out of these neighborhoods and have these empty neighborhoods, if you will, or these empty children, do those neighborhoods ever see any help? There's a lot of really historical institutional reasons why those neighborhoods are the way they are. So can you just say to move the child out of the problem is fixing the problem? I don't think it is.
Well, to me the problem is just children suffering. It's not.
But it's like a Band-Aid versus an actual attempt at curing something. You just keep moving a child. Like people will keep procreating despite these mandates you envision, and they'll keep procreating in these areas you don't want. So does that neighborhood ever get any help?
Well, I would say, first of all, if there are new children, then they have to leave, right? And their custodial parents would have to leave as well. My guess is that a neighborhood could go a couple of ways after it becomes childless. One is people look at themselves and say, what the hell have we done? We can do better, and they transform themselves, and there's a happy ending. The other more likely one is that it just becomes a free zone for crime, right? And people know that's where you go get the drugs, and that's where the police are going to stop enforcing because kids are gone, and so they don't care anymore. And maybe you have more concentrated crime, and that doesn't bother me. The basic problem is you need to separate children from adults who are doing horrible things. And if you try to move them together, it doesn't work, right? There's a certain group of people who are slinging the drugs and shooting the guns, and I would leave them there, and what they do to each other is not my concern.
And do you create more jobs to those neighborhoods? Because what if that's their economy? It's not a good economy, right? But I've met many people who that is how they get by, and it's not something they want to have, but they can't get a job for the bazillion reasons. And then that is, maybe mom does go work on the streets, maybe dad does sling drugs, maybe they really, really love their children. You just take them away. Does that fix the problem? Does that just remove the child? I don't think you're really getting to the main point of why these things actually exist. There's a lot of really historical reasons why neighborhoods are the way they are. And this, would the neighborhoods get worse? Perhaps, but I think a lot of criminals don't care if there's kids there. So they're gonna keep doing it anyway.
But we've tried fixing, right? We've spent the money on programs and services. We've tried to make our country a place where there are no unsafe places for children. and we fail, right? So maybe it's time to think about doing something else, and if nothing else, proposing it, seriously proposing it, might start a conversation that generates good results. As I said, I don't expect anyone with the power to actually take my things seriously. It's a thought experiment, and I leave to others the practicalities. I leave to others to worry about the adults. They have their advocates, as I said. If you want to tax me to support the programs, I'm happy, that's fine. But I'm worried about the kids.
We'll have Michael and Amabel, and then we're done.
Okay. One thing going back to what I said before. I really do think it's very important to have thought experiments like this. But I think that thought experiments also have to be really followed by facts and empirical stuff. First of all, a lot of the people that you're talking about who are committing the crimes and doing things are the kids that will be moved somewhere else. And a lot of them are the parents who will be moving with those kids. You started by saying there's two factors that have a big influence, parents and neighborhoods. But it's the parent, there's a lot of reason to think it's the parents who create the neighborhoods, and if you move them, there's a vast body of literature about neighborhood effects. And the vast body of literature on neighborhood effects is quite unclear whether there are neighborhood effects. It's a really big body of literature. And Robert Sampson and a lot of others have not been able to show neighborhood effects in the way that is being posited here. I just think all of these things are empirical that need to be asked. And then also I want to just end also by saying, I think you raised a very important question. What's the percentage, of if 25% are in a risk assessment, you get 25% positive, but you get 75% false positives. Is that okay? Just, in your local area, in West Virginia, 1 out of every 10 children is reported to Child Protective Services every year. In Pennsylvania, 1 out of 100 children is reported to Child Protective Services every year. I would propose that everybody from West Virginia have to move to Pennsylvania in order to give their kids 10 times a better chance of not being abused. As a thought experiment.
Well, I'm more practical than you are. I was starting on a small scale. This way. Teens, of course, are a problem. There's going to be there would be a transitional period, and you have to deal with teens somehow. But then after you do it, there are no more teens who grow up there.
Amabel, one last question.
Yeah, so I can see where you're coming from. Probably it's to make it more efficient. I mean, I could see where that could be helpful for judges, because when you're going through cases as quickly as you have to, and you don't have a lot of time, then they need heuristics. So I can see that as maybe a heuristic, but at the same time, it doesn't encompass everyone. There's still a need to evaluate each case on a case-by-case basis. And as far as the neighborhoods go, when you're talking about moving people from high crime areas, I mean, right now I work in Timberline, which is one of the worst neighborhoods in San Francisco, but there's also high density, and there's Little Saigon in the middle of it. And that's full of families, So when you're talking about moving families from a neighborhood, you're literally moving a whole culture out of it. And I'm not sure how we could balance that with, high crime rate, obviously, like we're moving everybody to that area that can afford it, and for the families that are there, that's the only place that they can afford to go. So I don't see where we could actually move the families who are safer when their roots are already within that neighborhood and with their community. So it's just something to consider.
Amanda?
I would say that a newborn child has no roots, is highly mobile, and from a child-centered perspective, I don't worry so much about that and other adult problems. And I leave it to you, very intelligent people who have expertise in other areas, to think about whether it's workable or not, and then I'll go on to another idea.